Welcome to this deep dive. And today we're looking at something pretty interesting, an article called Forking Drives Innovation, Not Competition. It's by a game designer, Reactorcore.
Interesting title.
Yeah, and they basically argue that, the whole concept of healthy competition is a myth. It doesn't even exist.
Hmm.
And they use some strong language to make their point. I mean, they call competition a farce, a travesty, a mockery, even outright bullshit.
Wow. That's
So right off the bat, we're in for a pretty provocative discussion.
yeah, definitely. And it sounds like Reactorcore is really passionate about this.
Totally. And I'm curious to hear what you make of this perspective.
Well, what's interesting is that this viewpoint isn't just like coming out of nowhere.
Right.
Reactorcore actually heavily references this book by Elfie Kohn. It's called No Contest: The Case Against Competition.
Okay, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's a pretty well-known work, and the article even links to one of Cohn's presentations. And in that presentation, Kohn kind of paints this picture of competition as something that leads to a lot of negative stuff like stress, anxiety, and this win at all costs mentality.
Yeah, I can see that.
Right. And I think a lot of us have probably felt that pressure at some point in our lives.
Totally.
Like where you're so focused on trying to be better than everyone else that it actually makes it harder to do good work.
Ugh, yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
And I'm curious, have you ever felt that kind of pressure yourself?
Absolutely. I think most of us have experienced that, whether it's at work trying to get that promotion
Mm-hmm.
or even just comparing ourselves to others on social media.
Oh, social media is a whole other beast.
It is, but I'm curious, how does this all connect back to innovation?
Yeah.
How does competition affect our ability to create new things?
That's a great question, and that's really the heart of Cohn's argument. He's basically saying that this constant pressure to compete, it actually stifles creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah, it pushes us into this mindset where we're more focused on beating others than on genuinely excelling at something.
Makes sense.
And that's where Reactorcore's idea of forking comes in.
Oh, so that's where that comes into play.
Exactly. So instead of trying to tear someone else's work down, you're taking the good stuff, leaving the bad, and then building on it, creating something new.
So it's about taking those existing ideas and branching out in a new direction, not starting from scratch, but building on what's already there.
Precisely.
And what's interesting is that Reactorcore actually shares this personal anecdote about how encountering Cohn's work was a major turning point for them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they say it actually completely shifted their approach to creative work. They even stopped playing competitive multiplayer games after reading Cohn's stuff.
Wow, that's a pretty big change.
It is, and it really shows how these ideas can have a real impact on the way we think and the way we work.
Totally. And it highlights that fundamental shift from competing against someone to building upon their work.
Yeah, it's a totally different way of thinking about it.
Right. And I think it has a lot of implications for how we approach innovation.
Exactly, and I'm curious to dive deeper into that. But before we do, I want to revisit something Reactorcore mentioned.
Okay.
They highlight these two different mindsets when it comes to creativity and innovation, and they actually use some pretty colorful language to describe them.
I'm intrigued. Let's hear it.
Okay, so the first mindset is screw this, your stuff sucks, I want to do it my way. And then the second one is more I'm going to make you look bad by making my thing better than yours.
Oh, those are definitely two distinct approaches.
Yeah, and I think they both represent pretty common ways of thinking about competition.
I can see that.
But it seems like they lead to very different outcomes.
For sure. And I'm curious, what do you think about those two mindsets?
Well, it seems to me like that first mindset, the one that's screw this, I'm doing it my way, is more about personal growth and doing something great for its own sake.
Yeah, it's like an internal drive.
Exactly.
While that second mindset, the one focused on making someone else look bad, that seems like it could easily lead to getting caught up in comparison.
Totally. And maybe even self-sabotage.
Yeah, because you're so focused on what someone else is doing
Yeah.
that you might lose sight of your own goals and your own vision.
Right. It's you're letting their work dictate your own instead of focusing on what you really want to create.
Exactly. And I think that can be a really dangerous trap to fall into.
I agree. And it seems like Reactorcore is advocating for a different path altogether.
A path that's more about collaboration and building upon each other's work.
Exactly. And I'm really excited to explore that further in this deep dive.
Me too. This is getting interesting.
It's fascinating how those two mindsets can shape our creative process. I mean, it's one is all about this individual drive, and the other is so focused on the external validation.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us probably oscillate between those two mindsets depending on the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. But I want to get back to this idea of forking that Reactorcore talks about.
Okay, let's dive into that.
Because it seems like such a different way of thinking about innovation. Like, instead of this like cutthroat competition, it's more about collaboration and building upon each other's work.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people might be wondering, like, how do you actually fork something? What does that even look like in practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, how do we move from theory to like real world application?
Well, let's think about it in terms of something familiar. Like, how you're always like trying out new productivity tools?
Oh, yeah, I'm a total productivity app junkie.
Right. Well, that's a perfect example of forking in action.
Really?
Yeah, because the developers behind those tools, they didn't just like start from scratch.
Right.
They looked at what already existed. They identified the pain points, the
Mm.
things that weren't working, and then they said, okay, how can we make this better?
So they're taking inspiration from what's already out there and then like building on it, improving it, making it their own.
Exactly. And I think that's how a lot of innovation actually happens, not in these like giant leaps, but in like incremental improvements, building upon what came before.
I like that idea, incremental improvements, because it makes innovation seem more accessible. Like, it's not just for like geniuses or these like brilliant inventors.
Exactly. Anyone can innovate.
And Reactorcore actually uses this phrase. They say, taking the good, discarding the bad, and forging a new path.
It's a nice way to put it.
It is. And it emphasizes like this process of discernment, right? Like recognizing the value in what already exists, but also being willing to like break away and do things differently.
It's about striking that balance between respecting the past and like embracing the future.
And I think that's a really key point because it's not about like blindly copying what others have done.
No, it's about understanding the why behind it, the principles behind it.
And then applying those principles in a new way.
Exactly. And it almost reminds me of this idea of the world as this massive open source project.
Oh, wow. That's a really cool analogy.
Yeah, like we're all contributing in our own ways, building upon each other's work. And I think that brings us back to the core idea of forking. It's not about tearing someone else down.
Right. It's about recognizing that like we're all in this together.
Exactly. It's about collaboration, even if it's indirect.
So even though Reactorcore uses some pretty strong language to criticize competition, like they're not actually anti-collaboration.
No, not at all. In fact, I think their ultimate message is actually one of collaboration and community.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that innovation rarely happens in a vacuum.
Exactly. And think about the evolution of programming languages, for example.
Okay.
Each new language often borrows and improves upon concepts from its predecessors.
Makes sense.
It's this continuous cycle of forking that has led to like some of the most powerful tools we use today.
And isn't that true in so many other fields as well? Like from art and music to science and technology, like we're constantly building upon the work of those who came before us.
Absolutely. And I think by embracing this forking mentality, we can unlock even greater potential for creativity and innovation. Because it's not about like winning or losing. It's about collectively moving forward.
I love that idea of collective progress.
Yeah, and it's about creating something new and valuable out of what already exists.
And I think that's such a powerful shift in perspective. Like it really changes the way you look at the creative process.
Totally. It takes the pressure off in a way.
Yeah, because it's not about being the first or the best. It's about making a meaningful contribution.
Exactly. And I think that's a much more sustainable and fulfilling approach to creativity.
I agree, and it seems like a lot more fun too.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And less stressful.
Totally. But I'm curious, how can our listeners who are like deep in the world of mention the listener's specific field or interest based on your user profile, like how can they apply this forking mentality?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to remember that forking isn't just about like developing apps or creating new technologies.
Right. It can be applied to pretty much any field.
Exactly. So let's think about it in the context of listener's field. Like, imagine you're working on a specific project or problem related to the listener's field.
Okay. I'm picturing it.
Now, instead of trying to like reinvent the wheel, could you look at existing solutions,
Okay.
identify what works and what doesn't, and then like adapt or build upon those ideas to create something even better?
That's a really interesting way to approach it. Yeah, that's a really interesting way to frame it. Like it's taking those building blocks and rearranging them to create something totally new.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that you don't have to start from scratch every time.
Right. You can build upon the work that's already been done.
And I think this forking mentality, it's not just about like big projects or professional endeavors.
You think it can apply to like personal goals too?
Absolutely. Think about it. Like, let's say your goal is to mention a relevant personal goal based on the listener's profile, e.g., run a marathon, learn a new language, write a book.
Okay, I'm following it.
Instead of starting completely from scratch, you could look at like training plans or language learning apps or writing guides that other people have already created.
Right, like use those as a starting point.
Exactly. You're not copying them, but you're using them as like a foundation, a springboard.
So you take the elements that work for you, discard what doesn't, and then build your own unique path to success.
Precisely. And I think that's the real beauty of this forking mindset. It allows us to be both innovative and efficient.
Yeah, you're not wasting time reinventing the wheel.
Exactly. You're building upon the collective wisdom and experience of others while still carving out your own unique path.
That's a really cool way to think about it, and it kind of ties back to that idea of collaboration that we were talking about earlier.
Right. It's like instead of seeing the world as this competition, you're seeing it as a collaboration.
And that shift in perspective, I think, can be really powerful.
Absolutely. It opens up a whole new world of possibilities.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation about forking?
I think the key takeaway here is that innovation doesn't have to be this like solitary competitive struggle.
Right. It can be more collaborative and community-driven.
Exactly. And by embracing this concept of forking, by looking at the world as this vast library of ideas to draw inspiration from and build upon, we can approach our work, our projects, even our personal goals with a sense of like collaboration, creativity, and maybe even a little bit of fun.
I love that. That's a great note to end on.
Yeah, I think it's a really empowering way to think about innovation.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into forking. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
My pleasure. I always enjoy these deep dives.
And to our listeners, if this idea sparked any new thoughts or questions, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, definitely reach out and let us know what you're thinking.
Keep exploring, keep creating, and keep forking your way to success.